Hey everyone, I hope you guys are having a great Tuesday. So I have some creepy Reddit posts for you guys to listen to, and I hope you guys enjoy. With that said, if you do, please leave a like, comment, or subscribe. So this happened years ago when I was a dumb teen girl who loved walking the city alone after dark. This took place in Eastern Europe for context. It happened in the city with a tramway station. On the one night, I sat in the tram station waiting to catch the last tram home. 3 trams stopped at the station, 2 of which went to where I was going to, which is important info for later. It was around 10 p.m., and as I sat there waiting, lost, in thought, I barely registered a man quietly walking up and standing by the shelter. I thought nothing of it, just someone else waiting for the tram, until I started feeling weird. The streets were quiet and dark, and there was no one else inside, just me and this guy. And I started wondering why he chose to stay standing this close to me, when he had so much space to avoid dealing with people. I couldn't comprehend anyone wanting to socialize this late at night, given that I was not very social myself. So I glanced at him trying to overthink it. He was a bald-headed, giant, tall, and built like a bear, big belly and big arms and legs, whereas I was 5'2" and scrawny. But that wasn't what scared me. It was the fact that he was staring right at me, unblinking and expressionless, not even attempting to look away or act embarrassed. No, this guy wanted me to feel uncomfortable, and I instantly felt weak and shaky, cold shivers down my spine. This was not normal. I realized very quickly that I was not in a good situation. I could have missed the last tram walking home, but that was out of the question, and my phone was almost dead. I was a shy kid, and I didn't have what it takes to scare this guy. I knew that, but I had to at least try. I only managed to utter a small "A," trying my best to startle him out of whatever he was thinking, but my attempt failed, in the face of his silent, threatening aura. He kept staring, no sign of intent to reply. He was enjoying this feeling. The panic rising inside me, I told myself to stay calm, and think rationally. Maybe he didn't hear me. Minutes had passed, and his stare continued to burn on my skin. There was also no tram in sight. Ignoring him didn't work, so I mustered up the courage to speak once again, but this time louder. "What do you want? Stop staring." No answer. He definitely heard me this time. I felt myself start to get angry, and I didn't want to let this guy get to me anymore. I didn't want to continue to give him the satisfaction of watching me squirm nervously, and also pretend that his behavior didn't bother me. I took a deep breath, and I forced myself to start thinking. I knew what I can't do. I can't fight him off. If he makes a move and there's nothing I can say or do that will get him to stop. I didn't know what his intentions were, but I knew that they weren't good. If I tried to walk away, he would probably follow. I could run, but he would most likely catch up to me before I can try to tire him out, since his legs were much stronger than mine. Even if I managed to somehow lose him walking home though, the dark alleys past the junkies and gypsies that were always prowling about could land me in an even worse situation. I could pretend to call someone, but he might feel compelled to act much sooner, if he felt threatened. So what can I do? The only thing that I could realistically be able to do was try and outsmart him. Somehow. So I started developing a few plans, depending on which trams it showed. I was trying to confirm whether he was just amusing himself and actually waiting for a tram to, or popped over for other more suspicious reasons, and whether I could actually get any kind of help. I couldn't let him see where I lived, so if he followed me, I have to be prepared to employ whatever strategy available. And for that, I needed to stay rational and very aware of my surroundings. While I was still thinking, the first tram showed up. It was the one that I could have taken home, but this one pulled into the depot right in my neighborhood, forcing me to lead him to my home. I hoped he would have boarded and leave me be, but he didn't. He kept watching me carefully. I let the tram go desperately, hoping it wasn't the last one, to head home. He continued to watch, and I sensed that he was quite happy with how things were going. I put up with it for another 15 minutes, trying to focus on another plan of action. I can now pretend that I needed the other tram, the one going to a different area of the city, and just ride to the next station, then getting off as soon as possible, so I don't end up too far and miss the tram that I need. This tram showed up next with my heart in my throat. I boarded it, and sat down by the door. He got onto it too, but set himself in the back pretty far from where I was. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking that this might still go well, when the tram then reached the next station. I got up and out not looking, and hoping it was all over, but when I stepped on the pavement and watched the tram drive away, I couldn't see him. In it, I turned my head slowly and was terrified to see him walking towards me, looking slightly pissed off. He stopped just a few steps away and resumed his staring, this time with a clear hint of malice. Still in silence, my vision blurred as I fought back tears of despair. He was not going to let me go. The helplessness I felt was unbearable, but I couldn't cry. I couldn't give up. I had to find a way. I had to get home. Tonight, this prospect of what might happen to me, any time now, if I didn't, was becoming way too real. My head was full of unanswered questions, regrets, and horrible scenarios. I wanted so badly not to have. To think anymore, to not have to fight back the tears and stay composed. But I knew this would be a cue to enact whatever fucked up plan he had in mind, and I couldn't let that happen. Then, I saw the final tram approach, the only one I couldn't take now, and I got on as quickly as my trembling legs would allow me to do. The bright lights were enveloping me. My mind snapped out of its nightmare spiral of fear and allowed me a moment of clarity. I had 3 stops to figure this out. I sat down at the front and looked at the driver. He was an old man, blissfully unaware of my distress. Getting the driver's attention was a no-go. We passed 1 stop. There was no one else. Waiting to climb aboard, I turned around fully expecting to see that psycho had followed me again. But I didn't expect him to be sitting right behind me. He wasn't taking any chances. He was making sure that I wouldn't try anything like last time. I shot him a hateful glare, and I allowed my anger to overcome my fear. I stood up and purposely walked over to another seat, in the middle of the tram car. I wanted to make it clear that I won't put up with this shit any longer. He got up, too, and slowly walked up to a spot 2 seats behind me, and diagonally from me, then sat down with the tiniest arrogant grin on his face. Already expecting it, I shot up and stood by the middle door, instead determined to keep him on his toes. If I stood right by the door, he wouldn't have any idea which station I planned to get off at. He remained where he was, this time convinced that I was bluffing. After all this was really the last tram. There was nothing else I could do to possibly escape. Now he must have reckoned, so my defiance was just a funny act to him. This was my chance. I had to take the risk. It had to work there. There were 3 doors in the tram and they're all open and closed at the same time. And they stayed open for around 5 seconds, before closing again. If no buttons were pressed or people detected on the threshold, the next stop, the only one left before mine, came into view. The tram slowed to a stop. The doors opened. I made my move. No more than 5 seconds passed and the door started to close. I bolted out and ran for it, reaching the back door as fast as I could, and slamming the button to open again. My whole body tense with adrenaline. I waited a long painful second and jumped back in, keeping my head low, holding my breath and crouching behind the nearest seat. I shut my eyes tightly and exhaled, slowly, while thanking the gods that I didn't believe in for that button working, and also wishing with all my might for him not to have seen me. Before I got back in, as I was waiting to hear his footsteps approaching, I pictured him frantically looking for me. He's still in the tram, face screwed up in anger, head turning like a fat, ugly meerkat, or was he catching his breath on the pavement of the last station? Mad eyes searching for the darkness for me, as the tram continued its loud journey, banging, clanging in sync with my heartbeat. I dared smile to myself, just imagining his face when he realized that he fucked up. Hand on my chest, I did my best to stealthily look around the corner, and found no one looking back. I then stood up in absolute excitement, throwing myself at the foggy back window. There he was, standing alone and victimless on that slow fading out of sight station, watching me leave, him and his vile plans, behind. Giving someone the middle finger never felt so good. I made it home and I told no one my story, for fear I'd been dismissed for my naivety. But I was safe and I was proud of myself. I definitely learned my lesson. Creepy stranger, I hope the events of the day taught you not to underestimate girls, as well as preventing you from becoming a criminal for the rest of your life. So I'm a 30-year-old transgender male. For the sake of my demeanor, when this event occurred, I was a timid 19-year-old lesbian, unleaded into the world. Immediately after graduation, I had just lost my job at McDonald's due to a massive flood taking out a lot of the businesses in my area. And I had a girlfriend that lived about 30 minutes away. And I needed gas money, so I took a job offered to me by a family friend at a 24/7 gas station in the next town over from mine. The shift I was working for was at 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and I had never worked a night shift in my life, but I thought it would be pretty cool to have little to no pressure other than making sure coffee was ready at 4 a.m. for the morning regulars. I was required to train on day shift for the first couple of weeks to get accustomed to the operation. Throughout those weeks, I learned many of the ins and outs of what takes place on night shift, and I also learned the ins and outs of the people that hung around the place for hours. And there were quite a few. One woman in particular, Melinda, would come in every morning before and after dropping her kids off at school, also around lunchtime, and sometimes actually buying a lunch. And during the evenings when her husband was home, she also came for hours. Considering that she lived a couple streets over, she was nice, and I started to really enjoy her visits. And we got along so well in the store, it was a fun atmosphere, for the most part. So it's finally time for me to work the night shift, and I had my manager with me for a few nights. I was taking her place on night shift, because she couldn't do it anymore. She was nice, and I admit, I had a pretty big crush on her, so I didn't mind spending time with her all night, and I learned when she worked the night shift. Belinda spent the entire night there. I had been working night shift alone for a couple of weeks, and some of those night shifts drug me into the days then when they were short-staffed. But again, I needed the money. Anyway, one night I was doing my chores, scrubbing the hot dog rollers and mopping the entire store. While emptying my mop bucket, I had heard the chime of the door, and I looked at my watch and saw it was 2 a.m., which was odd. There typically wasn't anyone coming into the store until 4 a.m. consistently, and I was a little upset, because I had literally just mopped that floor. But I went out to see who it was. Just as I headed out, the movement in the mirror overhead, which stops shoplifters, caught my eye. There was a man at the counter, doing something with the money order machine, and upon looking again, he had a knife. He was cutting the wires. For what reason I had no clue. While he was cutting, I had heard him muttering, "Where's Bonka?" over and over again. I knew I could walk back and get to the phone in the office, but I didn't want him to hear me, so I just pulled out my phone and texted Melinda to call the cops. And I tried to text quickly as much as what I could, and which I could describe. She told me she would be right down, and I was freaking out with every second that passed. Before she could get there, the man went outside to the gas pumps and threw all of the trash cans on the ground. He started to try and cut through the gas lines. I took this opportunity to lock the front door, just in case he tried to step back in, and thank God I did, because he immediately made a beeline to the door, then slammed his fist into it. Just as he did, the cops and Melinda then showed up, and he was put into the cop car, while I explained everything that had just happened. Turns out, Bonna was the name he called my manager, whose name was actually Bianca. He had become obsessed with her, the weeks prior dropping in nightly and making her night very uncomfortable, which explains why she couldn't take it anymore. They knowingly threw a timid 19-year-old into this mess, and sending me there instead of her. This turned into an obsession into rage, so to the man that became extremely unhinged when they took a woman out of a potentially dangerous situation, and to the woman that threw a naive teenager into his world, I could go my whole life without seeing any of you ever again. Fuck all of you. When my dad first told me this story as a kid, it really gave me the chills, and since I stumbled upon this sub, I might as well share it. I still remember every detail before going into the details. I'll give some context to set the setting and background. In 1985, my 19-year-old dad was serving in the Greek Army Special Forces in the Paratrooper Division Army Service in Greece. It was mandatory for every male that reached their 18th birthday and so on. Everyone had to go to military camps where each company is stationed, are mostly positioned in the countryside, and usually there isn't much going on near and around the camp. They're fairly secluded. The closest town to my pop's camp was 3 kilometers away. One night while serving, it was my dad's turn to go on guard duty in the camp. He was posted, and every night 5 to 6 soldiers were selected for guard duty, and they slept in the same barracks. Half an hour before, it was time for the previous guards to be relieved. Another soldier would come in the room, wake up the new batch so they could get ready, and then go to their positions. Each shift was 2 hours. The 12 to 6 a.m. shifts were the worst, according to my pops. It gets extremely cold in the winter, and you're half asleep standing beside your booth, freezing your butt off while keeping watch. The only way to be vigilant and keep warm is for you to take a few steps up and down. So it was 2 a.m., and my dad was standing next to his booth with his rifle. Absolute silence. He could only hear the wind. He mentioned that the moon was helpful with visibility, but there's so much that you can't make out at night, even with the moon apart from dark shadows, especially at longer distances. There were some tree lines far away, but there wasn't much vegetation around the camp at all. It was more like a clearing. Everything's going well like every other night, until a dark, tall mass appears from the path coming out of the tree line, and it's headed right towards my father's booth. My dad's heart stops pumping when he spots it, and he says he's scared shitless at this point. The mass moves slowly but steady, and it's closing the distance, almost like floating with big, slow steps. My dad does what he's instructed to do, and what every guard does in a situation like this. He raises his rifle, aims, and screams, "Halt! Identify yourself." No reply. The shadow continues to approach. Second time. "Halt! Identify yourself." Again, nothing. He told me at this point he was certain that he sees a ghost in real life. He says that then he thought to himself, let's see if a ghost can die. Before he engages, he was to scream a code word that raises the alarm. The way that works is the next guard in the next booth that is hundreds of meters away will hear the scream, then screams himself, and with a CH reaction like that, the alarm goes from booth to booth and reaches the patrol. Now the patrol is an officer with 5 soldiers that make the rounds between booths every night, and they make sure everything's okay with the guards. If you're caught sleeping or you're away from your post by these guys, rest in peace. They're also the ones to investigate an alarm. The only problem is, the patrol might take a while to get to the booth to raise the alarm, as they don't know which one it is, and they might be far from the right one. They run double time, though, every booth until they finally locate the original source of the alarm. My dad hears the other guy screaming, and he knows the alarm is raised. He knows that the patrol is going to be there in a few minutes. He also knows that the penalty for falsely raising the alarm is prison. Prison means a soldier gets X amount of days added to their service. The service back then was 2 years plus prison days that have been added to a soldier along the way from penalties. They don't actually lock you up in a cell unless you commit an actual crime. Then the military police comes in, but he doesn't have minutes. The eerie figure is 50 meters away and closing. He gets ready to fire. Then he hears "relax," and he says my dad's last name. It's me, another soldier covered in a black blanket that my dad knew was trying to sneak back into the camp that night after having fun in the nearest town without permission. He was holding a bottle of liquor too, and was fairly drunk. My dad let him through, but he knew he was about to get a serious amount of prison time for falsely raising the alarm. Once the patrol figured out it was his booth, that the alarm was raised from. The patrol gets there. My dad doesn't snitch on the drunk guy. The officer then tells them they'll see each other the next morning. It's the next day, online where the penalty are being announced by the officers. My dad's waiting to hear his name called, but they never even mention him. Even though an alarm raised is extremely rare to happen, nobody tells them anything. Turns out the patrol officer and the ghost were buddies. The guy sneaking in told the lieutenant what happened and did not mention my dad. The officer apparently pulled some strings and the whole incident was like it never happened. So there, yeah, it was a happy end after all. I really hope you guys enjoyed all those stories, and thanks for listening. It means everything to me. And with that said, as always, stay depraved.